अजीज़ ओ अहमद मासूम पर दुरूद परो, अली व फातिमा मगमूम पर दुरूद परो, हसन हुसैन से मज़लूम पर दुरूद परो, तमाम इम्मा मासूम पर दुरूद परो, मुहीब व चारिद मासूम पर दुरूद परो। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मद व आले मुहम्मद। इसी दुरूद से हो बंदगी खुदा के कबूल, इसी दुरूद से होते हैं खुश जनाब रसूल, इसी दुरूद से होते हैं नाजियों में शुमूर, इसी दुरूद से होते हैं कसर कुल्द में हूर। मुही वो चार दमासूम पर दुरूद परो। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मद व आले मुहम्मद। दुरूद पढ़ने से अफ़ज़ो सिफ़ात पाओगे, दुरूद पढ़ने से लुत्फ़े हयात पाओगे, दुरूद पढ़ने से अच्छी वफ़ात पाओगे, दुरूद पढ़ने से यारो नजात पाओगे। मुही वो चार दमासूम पर दुरूद पढ़ो। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मद व आले मुहम्मद। दुरूद पढ़ के पुकारा कलम दमे इरकां, अमीन रोकले अब तो सने जुबा की लगा, रसूल फातिमा ज़हरा है और बारा इमाम, यही बुज़ुर्ग है सब लायके दुरूद व सलाम। मुही वो चार दमासूम पर दुरूद पढ़ो। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्लि अला मुहम्मद व आले मुहम्मद।
सल्लल्लाहु अलैहि मोहम्मद व आले मोहम्मद। बुझ गई प्यास चचा, लौट के घर में आओ, बुझ गई प्यास चचा, लौट के घर में आओ, पूरी कर दो ये दुआ, लौट के घर में आओ, जानती हूँ कि कटे आपके बाजू रन में, आपके बाद चचा क्या है मेरे दामन में, कुछ नहीं करती गिला, कुछ नहीं करती गिला, लौट के घर में आओ, बुझ गई प्यास चचा। मुझको मालूम न था दूर वतन से आकर आप सो जाएंगे दरिया पे अलम लहरा कर। लो चचा दिन भी ढला, लो चचा दिन भी ढला, लौट के घर में आओ, बुझ गई प्यास चचा। ए चचा देखिए छिनती है पुपी की चादर, भाई सजाद का खैचा है लईने बिस्तर। क्या नहीं तुमको पता, क्या नहीं तुमको पता, लौट के घर में आओ, बुझ गई प्यास चचा। माँ ये कहती ही कि हम कैद भी होंगे अम्मू, छिन गई बालियाँ खाए हैं तमाचे अम्मू। देखो दामन भी जला, देखो दामन भी जला, लौट के घर में आओ, बुझ गई प्यास चचा। रो के ज़ैनब ने कहा बाली सकीना मेरी, बेचचा और बेपिदर होना है किस्मत तेरी। किसको देती है सदा, किसको देती है सदा, लौट के घर में आओ, बुझ गई प्यास चचा।
رحم الله من قرأ سورة الفاتحة. العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين وإياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله، والصلاة والسلام على إمام القبلتين ونبي الحرمين وأفضل الثقلين وجد الحسن والحسين، الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد.
وعلى أهل بيت الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين والذين ذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك على صاحب الدعوة النبوية والصولة الحيدرية والإسمة الفاطمية والحلم الحسنية والشجاعة الحسينية والعبادة السجادية والمعاثر الباقرية والآثار الجعفرية والعلوم الكاظمية والحجج الرضوية والجود التقوية والنقاوة النقوية والحيبة العسكرية والغيبة الإلهية. اللهم عجل فرجه وسهل مخرجه. أما بعد، فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والشعراء يتبعهم الغاوون ألم تر أنهم في كل واد يهيمون وأنهم يقولون ما يفعلون إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وذكروا الله كثيرا وانتصروا من بعد ما ظلموا وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. For the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of Fatimah Zahra in particular, a second salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the hastening of the reappearance of the master of our time, a louder salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. When one examines the literature about the day of Ashura, they'll find that present within the literature about that day is the presence of different battlefield poetry, otherwise known as a Rajaz within the Arabic language. You see in the style of the Arabs that whenever they would go and fight, from the first aspect you would find that it is one-on-one combat, or 2-on-2 combat, or 3-on-3 combat, but you find each person is focused upon an individual person. Within the course of these battles, we find the presence of a form of poetry which would describe, number one, themselves, number two, it would describe their family or their tribe, number three, it would describe their virtuous qualities. And number four, it would show how low the other side is for fighting them. This genre of poetry, which would be a series of short utterances at the beginning of a battle, is known as a Rajaz within the Arabic language. That when you look on the day of Ashura, you find that there is a number of Rajaz poetry which the companions of Imam al-Hussein and even Sayyid al-Shuhada, him recited upon that day. You see, this Rajaz poetry is something which was carried on from before Islamic times, and it continued within the Islamic world. As in one of the most famous examples of the battlefield poetry occurs upon the day of Khaybar. When Rasulullah, he says, "La u'tiyanna rayata ghadan rajulan karraran wa ghayra farrarin. Yuhibbu Allah wa rasulah wa yuhibbuhu Allah wa rasulah." The Prophet says that tomorrow I am going to give the flag, the alam, to a man. An individual who is brave, somebody who doesn't run away, somebody who loves Allah and His Prophet, and Allah and His Prophet, they love that individual. You see, Islamic spirituality revolves around one gaining the love of God and one becoming the beloved of God. If there is anyone in history that their love for God and God's love for them had been certified upon the tongue of Rasulullah, then it's none other than Ali ibn Abi Talib. You see, when Rasulullah says this line, Amir al-Mu'mineen, when he goes upon the day of Khaybar and he fights Marhab, you find that Amir al-Mu'mineen recites a line of poetry where he says, Ana alladhi sammatsni ummi Haydara, that I am the one that my mother had named me Haydar. You see, this form of poetic utterance by Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, this form of utterance is what is referred to as the battlefield poetry or the Rajaz. Now, when it comes to the analysis of the Rajaz poetry or the battlefield poetry, we have to acknowledge that yes, its origins are in pre-Islamic Arabia. When one examines pre-Islamic Arabia, there were a number of characteristics which Islam sought to reform and characteristics which aren't worthy of a human being. For example, in pre-Islamic Arabia, they would bury their daughters alive if they had a female child. These individuals, they would do tawaf around the Kaaba naked without wearing clothes. There would not be a system of overarching justice. But at the same time, in the same way there were flaws within pre-Islamic Arabia, one has to admit and acknowledge that there were certain characteristics of the Arabs which were positive and viewed in a positive light in Islam. For example, the Arabs of pre-Islamic Arabia were known to be individuals of generosity, and they respected people of generosity. We find that they have the famous example of the mythical figure Hatim al-Ta'i, who existed, but you find that the question as to whether the tales are exaggerated or not is something which is up in the air. You find another quality amongst the pre-Islamic Arabs which was praised in Islam was the quality of bravery, that they respected an individual who could be brave on the battlefield and not run away. You find they were individuals who would respect their guests and they would honor their guests. You see, when we say that Islam came to reform society, you find that there are three different levels that Islam dealt with the culture from that time of pre-Islamic Arabia. At the first level, there were certain elements which were incompatible with the Islamic message, and Islam was not flexible with those elements. For example, you find the worship of idols is something which is an antithesis to the Islamic doctrine of Tawheed or monotheism. Even to the extent that when you look at the cause of the revelation of Surah Al-Kafirun, which says, قُلْ يَا أَيُّهَا الْكَافِرُونَ, that prophets say to the disbelievers, لَا أَعْبُدُ مَا تَعْبُدُونَ, that I will not worship what you worship, nor will you worship what I worship. And the verse chapter, it concludes by saying, لَكُمْ دِينَكُمْ وَلِيَ الدِّينِ, to you belongs your path, and to me belongs my path. You see, a group of individuals from the kuffar of that time, they come to Rasulullah. They notice that Islam is something which is a reality that they have to deal with. So they say, Ya Rasulullah, for a particular number of months, we will worship your Allah. But for the same number of months, then after that, you will worship our idols and we'll cut a deal with you in this manner. You find when it came to such an act, Islam said there were certain practices of the pre-Islamic Arabs that it has come to eradicate. Yes, Islam is enforcing itself upon someone, but there are certain acts which are antithetical to the reality of Islam. So you find that this was one level of reform. The second level of reform is that there were certain actions which were revered by the pre-Islamic Arabs that had lost its form. So Islam didn't remove it completely, it reformed it back to its origins. For example, amongst the Arabs, the Kaaba was a place of sacredness. The Arabs, they would go to Hajj. They would perform the tawaf around the Kaaba. But you find that there were elements which were introduced that were not upon the deen of the Nabi Ibrahim. So for example, the removal of the idols from the Kaaba is something Rasulullah carries out after the conquest of Makkah. You know, when the conquest of Makkah happens, Rasulullah, after all of these years of being outcasted from his land, now he is returning towards its home. You find that there were certain companions who didn't understand the message of Rasulullah. They said, now that we're returning to Makkah, al-yawm yawmul malhama. Now it is the time for revenge and destruction upon these kuffar now that we're in strait. Rasulullah says, do not say this line. Al-yawm yawmul marhama. This is the day of mercy and forgiveness. You see, Rasulullah, he goes towards the Kaaba and they remove the idols from the Kaaba. When they remove the idols from the Kaaba, you find that there was one idol on top of the Kaaba, the largest of the idols. Rasulullah lifts Amir al-Mu'mineen. Amir al-Mu'mineen breaks that idol and he falls to the ground smiling. Rasulullah says, Ya Ali, you fell upon the ground. Why are you smiling as you fell upon the ground? Amir al-Mu'mineen says, how can I not smile when it is Muhammad who lifted me up and it is Jibreel who placed me upon the ground? So you find this second level of reform from the culture of the pre-Islamic Arabs and the practice of the pre-Islamic Arabs didn't remove the importance of the Kaaba or the importance of Hajj. Because we find that we acknowledge that Nabi Ibrahim and the previous Anbiya have a status. But you find there was a third group of actions and practices which Islam did not necessarily comment upon. What I mean by this is that, for example, in Islam, to get married within the Shariat is the nikah. But Islam doesn't say what type of dress a person has to wear. Yes, as long as that dress is within the bounds of the Sharia, when you get married, whether you wear yellow or red or white or green, it doesn't make a difference from that regard. You see, from the Islamic perspective, mankind cannot live without culture. That when you are living in a society, at one level, you're going to be a product of the place and the time that you live in. But culture only becomes an issue when it supersedes upon the bounds of the Sharia and Islamic law. And based upon this, you find when you look at the culture of different civilizations, without a doubt, literature and poetry plays a large part within every civilization, and particularly amongst the pre-Islamic Arabs. You see, the pre-Islamic Arabs were a group who emphasized poetry, and they would give respect to those who would be able to be strong in language skills. That's why when the Quran was revealed, the Arabic of the Quran was something which was miraculous towards those individuals. You know, one day when Surah Al-Kawthar was revealed, they hung Surah Al-Kawthar in writing upon the Kaaba. And when they hung it upon the Kaaba, everyone was mesmerized as to look at the rhythm, look at the wording, look at the meaning. In that time period, there was a poet by the name of Shah. Shah, he wouldn't speak all year round. Because he would say, if I'm always talking, sometimes I'm going to be eloquent. Sometimes I'm not going to be eloquent, and it's going to take away from my value. So once a year, he would gather and he would recite his poetry, and people would look at the poetry of Shah. But this individual, others would bring them their poetry and he would correct it. He wouldn't say anything. He would bring it upon the right meter and he would tell them. But when Surah Al-Kawthar was taken to Shah, and he reads the lines, that Shah who wouldn't speak all year round, when he reads, Inna a'tayna kal kawthar, that, O Prophet, we have given you abundance. فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْحَرْ, and sacrifice towards him. إِنَّ شَانِئَكَ هُوَ الْأَبْتَرُ, and indeed your enemies, their lineage is cut. That Shah wouldn't speak all year. He says, مَا هَذَا مِنْ كَلَامِ الْبَشَرِ بَلْ هُوَ فَوْقَ مِنْ كَلَامِ الْبَشَرِ. This is not the words of any human being, but rather it is more elevated than the words of a regular human being. In other words, every language has either poetry or prose. Prose is straightforward speech. Poetry is that rhythmic speech. But in the Arabic language, you find that there is a third category. One category is poetry. Another category is prose. But the third category is Quran. Because the Quran was neither straightforward speech, but at the same time, the Quran is not poetry. But rather, this is the miracle of the Quran. And when you look within the Quran, you find that the Quran acknowledges the position of the poet within pre-Islamic Arabia in chapter 26, which is called Surah Al-Shu'ara, named after the poets. You see, when you look at Surah Al-Shu'ara, and you look at the final verses from verse 224 to 227, you find that the Islamic perspective on poetry and poets is found within these verses. And the Quran, it says something interesting. It says, وَالشُّعَرَاءُ يَتَّبِعُهُمُ الْغَاوُونَ, that only the misguided, they follow the poets. أَلَمْ تَرَى أَنَّهُمْ فِي كُلِّ وَادٍ يَهِمُونَ, have you not seen those poets going into every valley aimlessly? وَأَنَّهُمْ يَقُولُونَ مَا لَا يَفْعَلُونَ, and they say that which they don't act upon. You see, over here within these verses, Rasulullah is someone who was differentiated from being a poet. One of the accusations that the Arabs of that time would make is that Rasulullah is simply a poet. You know, the Quran in Surah Al-Safat, it says, وَيَقُولُونَ, and they say, أَإِنَّ لَتَارِكُ آلِهَتِنَا لِشَائِرٍ مَجْنُونَ, that are we going to leave our Lord for a poet who is majnoon, who is delirious? You find that the Quran over here is showing that these individuals who are making the accusation of the Prophet being a poet, is that there is a difference between poetry and the reality of Rasulullah. Because poetry is something which is built upon imagination. A poet, when he speaks based upon imagination. But the Quran as a book of guidance, and Rasulullah came to bring guidance towards mankind. But from the second level, you find that these ayat of the Quran, it explains Islam's issue with the poets. It says that number one, the poets are those individuals that those who are misguided follow them. Because in that time period in pre-Islamic Arabia, the theme of poetry was nothing but desires and this world and women and nothing more beyond that. Those who follow the poets were considered to be those who are misguided. From the second level, the issue that Islam had with the poets is that their poetry had no goal within it. There was no reality being explained. There was no purpose behind it. وَأَنَّهُمْ فِي أَلَمْ تَرَ أَنَّهُمْ فِي كُلِّ وَادٍ يَهِمُونَ, do you not see that they're going into every valley? And at the third level, you find it says these are those individuals, when they speak, they don't act upon that speech. In other words, what we learn from these ayat is that Islam itself does not have an issue with poetry, but rather it has an issue with a specific type of poetry. Because in Surah Al-Shu'ara, chapter 26, verse 227, after mentioning these ayat about the flaws within the poets, it gives an exception. It says all of these poets, the misguided follow them. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, except for those who believe. Number one. وَآمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, and they act righteously. Number two. وَذَكَرُوا اللَّهَ كَثِيرًا, and they remember Allah greatly. Number three. وَانْتَصَرُوا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا ظُلِمُوا, and these individuals, when they write their poetry, they support one another after being oppressed. In other words, one of the poetry which is praised within the Quran is the poetry for those who are madloom and for those who are oppressed. Based on this, it should come to no surprise that when it comes to the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, we have a number of traditions praising, reciting poetry or writing poetry for Ahlul Bayt. For example, one tradition says, Man anshada fina bayta shirin bana Allahu lahu baytan fil jannah. That the one who recites a bayt in Arabic is 2 lines of poetry. The one who recites 2 lines of poetry for us Ahlul Bayt, Allah will create a home for them in paradise. And that is why when you look upon the day of Ashura, you find that there was a number of battlefield poetry and Rajaz recited by the companions of Imam al-Hussein. And when you examine the qualities of their poetry, you find all 4 qualities of a poet which are praised in the Quran are found within these individuals. That these individuals have iman and belief. And these were individuals who acted righteously. And they were individuals who remembered God greatly. And number 4, they are those individuals that their poetry is in the support of the madloom and who are oppressed. You see, tonight in tonight's majlis, I'll examine 10 lines of the battlefield poetry from the day of Ashura. That'll examine 10 different poems which were called Rajaz upon that day. The first of those battlefield poems or Rajaz poetry from the day of Ashura was a line by a companion by the name of whom his name was Bashir ibn Amar Al-Hadrami. I mentioned yesterday that Bashir ibn Amar Al-Hadrami was an individual that when he comes to Karbala, a time had come that his son had been captured in Kufa. And Imam al-Hussein says to him, Bashir, that you are free to go and tend to your son. You have completed your responsibility towards me. This Bashir says, Ya Aba Abdullah, that if I am to leave you, then let the beasts of the desert devour me, O Aba Abdullah. In other words, my concern is not my personal family or my personal wealth. But if I have a concern, my concern is Hussein and the family of Rasulullah. You know, this Bashir, when he was struck, the lines of poetry that he recites is Al-Yawm Ya Nafsu, that upon this day, O soul, Ulqi Ar-Rahman, that upon this day you are going to meet the one who is an all benevolent. وَالْيَوْمْ تُجْزَيْنَا بِكُلِّ آسَانٍ لَا تَجْزَئِ فَكُلُّ شَيْءٍ فَانٍ وَالصَّبْرُ أَخْتَلَقَ إِنْ الدَّيَانِ. He says that today you will meet the one who is the all-merciful. And today you will be rewarded with virtue and goodness when you sacrifice yourself for Hussein. Then he speaks to his soul. He says, O soul, do not fear, for every single thing will perish, and you find patience is that which will be rewarded upon the day of judgment. You see, the first thing that we see within this battlefield poetry of Bashir ibn Amar al-Hadrami is number 1, that Bashir, when he addresses this poetry, he is addressing it to his own nafs, to his own self. That in one manner, Bashir is saying that in the way man has an external enemy, at the same time, we have an internal enemy. And that internal enemy only becomes something which is an enemy when it goes unchecked. In that manner, the soul of an individual is something which requires vigilance. That's why the ulama, they say that when one wants to discipline themselves, the first condition is musharata, and making the condition that I won't go back towards my old methods. The second level is muraqaba and vigilance. And the third level is muhasaba and taking account. That every day, an individual at least one time, and according to the tradition of Imam al-Qadim 2 times, they reflect upon themselves that what did I do today which was positive, and what did I do today which is negative. So you find this spiritual element that Bashir, he is speaking to himself, and he says that line, that, O soul, do not fear, for everything will perish. You see, one element of bravery upon the day of Ashura is that these individuals had a comfortable relationship with death. They didn't see death as something which is scary necessarily, but rather they saw death as a bridge towards the reward of Allah, to seeing the reality of God at a higher capacity. So in this manner, you find this is found in the Rajaz of Bashir ibn Amar. The second Rajaz, which I'll examine upon this night, is there was a companion of the Imam by the name of Junada ibn al-Harith. Junada ibn al-Harith is one of those shuhada that the works of history don't give a large amount of detail about Junada. But what you do find about Junada within the sources is that Junada recited a line of battlefield poetry. When he recited that line, he says, Ana Junadun wa ana ibn al-Harithi. That I am Junada, and I am the son of Harith. After he mentions this line, he says that I am an individual who will not fear what is coming towards me. Ana Junadun wa ana ibn al-Harithi. Lastu bi khawwarin wala bi makitin an bayati hatta yarithni wariti. He says, I am an individual who will not be at loss, who will not fear, and I am an individual who will not break my vow until my successor weeps over me. Al-yawm tari fis sa'id makiti. And upon this day, my body in the ground will go. You see, the quality of Junada that we see from this Rajaz poetry is that Junada emphasizes that one praiseworthy quality is that an individual does not break their vow, whether it is towards God or towards another believer. You know, in the time of Rasulullah, there was an individual by the name of Ta'laba. Ta'laba would go to Rasulullah and he would say, Oh Rasulullah, make dua that my business, it takes off. That make dua that I'm given a lot of wealth. Rasulullah says, Ta'laba, this isn't something which is good for you. Because there's certain people, the moment money comes into their pocket, that person, it's as if you've never seen that person before. That they change. Rasulullah says, Oh Ta'laba, this wealth isn't good for you. But Ta'laba says, Oh Rasulullah, I am making an oath that if I am given wealth, I would give it in the way of Allah. Rasulullah makes a dua for Ta'laba. You know, the moment Ta'laba, his business begins to take off and he begins to get more sheep to give towards other people, instead of praying behind Rasulullah for every prayer, he begins to go just for Fajr and Maghrib. After that, it continues to grow. Instead of Fajr and Maghrib, it becomes once a day. After that, it becomes the day of Jummah only. And after that, you find Ta'laba, khalas, nowhere to be found. Rasulullah, this individual, he made an oath to Rasulullah. Rasulullah said, if you make this oath, I'll make a dua for you. Rasulullah says, now the verse of zakat has been revealed. Go to Ta'laba and collect zakat from Ta'laba. Ta'laba replies by saying that tell Muhammad that he is collecting jizya and a tax from us I won't give it towards him. This individual, because of the fact that he broke an oath and an oath to Rasulullah, he went in such a downward spiral that he went from being in the folds of Islam to saying the name of Rasulullah with disrespect and leaving the bounds of Islam. So you find that one of the most spiritual acts an individual can carry out in their life is to keep a promise and an oath towards someone else. So you find this was the second line of Rajaz, which we'll examine. The third line of Rajaz, or battlefield poetry, was the poetry of Al-Hurr ibn Yazid al-Riyahi. You know, when Hurr comes to the side of Sayyid al-Shuhada, and he's fighting upon the battlefield, he says, Inni ana al-Hurr wa ma'wa dayfi, adribu fi a'naqikum bis-sayfi, an khayra man halla bilad al-khayfi, adribukum wa la ara min hayfi. He says that I am a Hurr, the one who takes care of his guests. Today I will strike you with my sword in defense of the best individual who lived in the land of Mecca. And when I strike all of you, I will see no fault in my striking of you. You see, when Hurr recites this line of poetry, number one, he shows that his goal is for Sayyid al-Shuhada. But the quality which Hurr emphasizes in his poetry is that he was an individual who would look after the guests. You know, there was a famous scholar who would say that no matter what action you do not consider it insignificant. Because you never know what action it is which will tip the scales in your favor on the day of judgment. And that is a profound reality. You know, when you look at the seerah of Ahlul Bayt would look after any needy individual that would come towards their doorstep. You know, when you look at Imam al-Hasan, an individual comes from Syria cursing Amir al-Mu'mineen. Imam al-Hasan says, oh man, are you hungry? If you are, I will give you food. If you need clothing, I will give you clothing. If you don't have a place to stay, then you will be my guest. You see, this is that reality of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. So you find that this was the next of the Rajaz poetry. After that, the fourth Rajaz poetry from the day of Ashura is the poetry of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn. You see, Zuhair ibn al-Qayn was such a companion that Imam al-Hussein in his final moment, he takes the names of a number of companions and he begins to speak to their bodies. He says, Ya Habib ibn al-Madahir, wa ya Muslim ibn al-Awsaja, wa ya Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, Ya Abtal al-Safa, wa ya Fursan al-Hayja, Mali unadikum fala tajibun. He says, O Habib, O Muslim, O Zuhair, O brave fighters, O valiant warriors, why is it when I call upon you, you don't reply to me? You see, when such an individual is honored in the eyes of Ahlul Bayt, they must have unwavering devotion to Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. And when you look at the devotion of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn, when Zuhair he goes and he fights on the day of Ashura, he says, Ana Zuhairun wa ana ibn Qayni, aduduhum bis-sayfi an Husayni. That I am Zuhair, I am the son of Qayn. I will repel them with my sword from Hussein. You see, this is that devotional element. After that, when you look at the Rajaz or the battlefield poetry, you find one more line of poetry is mentioned by a companion of the Imam by the name of what? His name is Shabib ibn Abdullah. Shabib ibn Abdullah, and you find this individual, he says, Abshiri Hudita Rushta, that, O soul, you have been given the good tidings of guidance. You know, if an individual has everything within the world, but they lose their direction. In reality, they have nothing. Abshiri hodita rushta talka ahmada fi jannatil firdausi ta'lu so'ada. That you will be given a meeting with Rasulullah and you will be elevated to the highest levels of Jannatul Firdaus. You see, one fundamental theme that we see within the lives of the companions of Imam al-Hussein time and time again is their devotion towards Rasulullah. You know, many people, they ask the question that what fundamental basis should we give our children? There's a hadith of Imam Jaffar as-Sadiq, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. That hadith of the Imam says that teach your children three things. Number one, teach them the recitation of the Quran. Number two, teach them the love of Rasulullah. And number three, teach them the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. You see, the love of Ahlul Bayt is that force that there's times in the life of a person they waver, they go left, they go right, they make mistakes. But as long as the love of Ahlul Bayt is there, you find that that force is within them that can bring them back. How many individuals are there? You only see them on the mosque on the day of Ashura. Instead of saying that, look, they neglect everything, we need to reflect from that angle that if there is one thread connecting them to the deen, then that thread is Sayyid al-Shuhada. And that is that reality of the Imam. So you find after these lines of poetry, the line of Junada, the line of Bashir, the line of Shabib, the line of Hor, you find the next Rajaz from the day of Ashura is the Rajaz of Ali Akbar, the son of Sayyid al-Shuhada. You know, when Ali Akbar goes upon the day of Ashura, he says, Ana Ali ibn al-Hussein ibn Ali. That I am Ali, the son of Hussein, the son of Ali. Nahnu wa baytillahi awla bin Nabi. La yahkumu fina ibn al-Da'i. Adribu bisayf ohami an abi. Darba ghulamin qarashiyan hashimi. He says that I am Ali, the son of Hussein, the son of Ali bin Abi Talib. That by the Lord of the house, we are the ones who have the greatest right and closeness to Rasulullah. And that individual who is an illegitimate individual, he will never rule over us. And I will strike them defending my father, the strike of somebody who is Hashemian from Quraysh. You see, time and time again, the reason Ahlul Bayt remind of their own background to the other side is that those individuals had forgotten the reality of Ahlul Bayt, of Banu Hashim. And time again, you find they would remind of the reality of Amir al-Mu'mineen. The next line of Rajaz from the day of Ashura is you find is that there is a Rajaz and a battlefield poetry of Sayyid al-Shuhada. You know, Imam al-Hussein, as he was fighting upon the day of Ashura, he says these lines of poetry. He says, Al-Ar, Ola, he says what? He says, Al-Maut, Ola min Rukub al-Ar. Wal-Ar, Ola min Dukhul al-Nar. Ana al-Hussein ibn Ali. Ahmi ayalati abi. Alaytu an la antani. Amdi ala din al-Nabi. Imam al-Hussein says what? He says that death is better than humiliation. And humiliation is better than entering the fire of hell. I am Hussein, the son of Ali, and I am the one who will defend the family of my father. I will remain steadfast and I walk upon the deen of Rasulullah. You see, this first line of Sayyid al-Shuhada, where he says death is better than humiliation, and humiliation is better than entering the fire is a very profound line. Imam al-Hussein is saying this, that number one, if you have a choice between death and to humiliate yourself, to become degraded within the eyes of people, that they make fun of you for you doing something which is brought upon yourself, then death is better than that reality. Because as long as a person is alive, they should know their value. And Amir al-Mu'mineen in a tradition says that, O human being, the minimum value that you should sell your soul for is paradise. That in other words, the minimum worth that each of us carries is that God created us for paradise. But you find Imam al-Hussein is saying that if it comes to being humiliated or choosing between death, then death is better. But then after that he says, وَالْآرْ أَوْلَى مِنْ رُكُوبِ النَّارِ. When it comes to humiliation or to entering the fire, then you find that to be humiliated within this world is better than to be humiliated within the hereafter. Imam Zainul Abidin in a dua in a Sahifatul Sajjadiyah says that, O Allah, if there is a loss between my dunya and my hereafter, then let that loss be within the dunya. Because this is something which is more temporal, and the hereafter is something which is infinite in its reality. But as you examine the Rajaz poetry from the day of Ashura, without a doubt, one of the most profound lines of poetry is the poetry of Aba Fadl Abbas from the day of Ashura. You know, when Aba Fadl Abbas, he goes towards the battlefield and he sees the enemy as he's going towards the Furat, he says, La arhabul mawta idil mawts raqa. That I am not an individual who fears death when death comes upon me. Hatta awari fi masaliti liqa. And I will not remain fearful even if the swords are over me. Nafsi li nafsil Mustafa at-Tahr waqa. My soul is sacrificed for the soul of Rasulullah. Inni anal Abbas aghdu bis-saqa. I am Abbas, the one who brings water to other individuals. La akhafu shar yawm al-multaqa. That I do not fear evil upon that day of meeting my Lord. You see, who is Aba Fadl Abbas? Aba Fadl Abbas was the dua of Amir al-Mu'mineen. It took over a decade that after Amir al-Mu'mineen marries al-Baneen, that Aba Fadl Abbas comes into this world. You know, whenever the children of Amir al-Mu'mineen were born, Imam Ali had a tradition that he would kiss the forehead of each of his children. But when Abbas was born, Amir al-Mu'mineen doesn't kiss the forehead of Abbas. He kisses the arms of Aba Fadl Abbas. And when he kisses the arms of Aba Fadl Abbas, at that moment, Baneen, she comes to the Imam. And she says, O Master, why did you kiss the arms of Abbas? Why didn't you kiss the forehead? Is it because he's the son of a slave, Baneen? Amir al-Mu'mineen says, O Baneen, it's not for that reason, but O Baneen, this is that Abbas whose arms will be cut for Hussein, O Baneen. This is Aba Fadl Abbas. You know, upon the day of Ashura, Aba Fadl Abbas, he looks at one after another going. He notices that On and Muhammad are gone. and he notices that the body of Qasim has been broken to pieces. He waits one shaheed after another. But that time it comes where Aba Fadl Abbas, he goes to Sayyid al-Shuhada. And he says, "Oh master, can you give me permission?" The Imam says, "Ya Abbas, anta sahibu liwa'i ya Abbas." "Oh Abbas, you carry the alam of my army, O Abbas." At that moment, فَنَظَرَ إِلَى يَمِينِهِ وَالشِّمَالِهِ. Abbas looks to the right. He looks to the left. He says, "Oh master, which army is left that I'm the commander of?" Sayyid al-Shuhada gives Aba Fadl Abbas permission to get water. You know, when Aba Fadl Abbas, he reaches the Furat, he recites another line of poetry. He says, "Ya nafsu min ba'd al-Husayn huni, wa ba'dahu la kunti aw takuni. هذا حسين وارد المنون وتشربين بارد المائين." He says, "O soul, after Hussein you are nothing. After him neither were you nor will you be. You want to drink from this water, whereas Hussein is drinking from the water of death at this moment." Aba Fadl Abbas, he takes the water. He places it within the water bag. As Aba Fadl Abbas, he's carrying the flag, the mashk, the water bag is upon that flag. He begins to come back towards the tent, and as he's coming back from the tent, you find Aba Fadl Abbas is struck. When Abbas is struck, they cut the right arm of Aba Fadl Abbas. You know, when they cut the right arm of Aba Fadl Abbas, he recites another line of Rajaz. He says, "Wallah in qata'tum yamini, inni uhami abadan an dini, wa an sibtin nabiy tahir al-amini." He says that even if you cut my arms, I will defend the grandson of Rasulullah. Then after that, when they cut the right arm of Aba Fadl Abbas, he takes that alam in towards the left arm. But a point it comes that they cut the left arm of Abbas. Abbas, he takes the water bag by the teeth. He recites the lines. He says, "Ya nafs." He says, "O soul, la takhsha min al-jabbar, min al-kuffar," that do not fear the disbelievers. Wa abshiri bi rahmatil jabbar, and you'll take that mercy from God. And he recites the rest of the line of poetry. You know, at that moment, as the water bag is within the teeth of Aba Fadl Abbas, as Abbas is coming back towards the tent, an arrow of Hurmala goes into that water bag. That water, it begins to pour on the ground. After that, Abbas doesn't go towards the tents. Abbas, he turns around. But it's stated at that moment, one arrow goes into the right eye of Abbas. You know, there was a reciter in Karbala. He was reciting this masaib. There was an alim by the name of Yahya Yathribi. He says, "Oh reciter, don't recite this masaib. You don't know if it's authentic. You don't know if an arrow went into the eye of Abbas." Yahya Yathribi narrates that night I saw Aba Fadl in my dream. And Abbas, he says to me that, "Why did you stop my reciter?" I said, "Oh master, I didn't know if the Masaib was authentic." Aba Fadl Abbas says within that statement, he says that no, that an arrow went into my eye. But whenever something goes into your eyes, the first reaction is that you move your arms to remove it. But at that moment, I didn't have any arms. I would look to the right. I would look to the left. I put that arrow in between my knees. As the arrow is in between my knees, I pulled that arrow from my eye upon that day. Hamid bin Muslim says, as Hussein went to the body of Abbas, he would stop and he would hold something to his chest. Then he would go further, he would hold it to his chest. When I looked closer, I saw that it was 2 cut arms upon the ground. You know what the musibah of Aba Fadl Abbas is? It's stated in Karbala. Water had come into the shrine of Aba Fadl Abbas. And there was an alim by the name of Sayyid Mahdi Bahar al-Ulum who was looking over the reconstruction. As the reconstruction is happening, one of the workers comes to Sayyid Bahar al-Ulum. He says, "Oh Sayyid, can I ask you one question?" The Sayyid, he says, that asked your question. He says that whenever you would recite the musibah of Abbas, you would say that Abbas was a tall individual. My question is that why is it that the grave of Abbas is so small? Sayyid Bahar al-Ulum, he takes off his turban, his amama. He says that no, that Abbas is that shaheed, that not only did they cut the arms of Abbas, but when they trampled the body of Abbas, the body of Abbas would be broken to pieces. Ala la'natullah ala al-qawm al-zalimin ya Hussein.
Ya Abbas, Ya Abbas, Ya Abbas, Ya Abbas, ऐसा आलम है कहाँ, ऐसा जवा है कहाँ, ऐसा आलम है कहाँ, ऐसा जवा है कहाँ. ये है अबू तालिब का घराना, इस पे खुदा का कास कलम है. सारे अरब में सारे अजम में किसको मिला ये जाहो हशम है. इनमें कोई यासीन व मुज़म्मिल, इनमें कोई सरदार इरम है. सीनो मुज़म्मिल, इनमें कोई सरदार इरम है. उसकी अलग ही शान है मौला, जिसको मिला है दर का अलम है. ऐसा अलम है कहाँ, ऐसा जवा है कहाँ, ऐसा अलम है कहाँ, ऐसा जवा है कहाँ. कैसा सजा है, कैसा हंसी है, करबो बला में शाह का लश्कर. यूँ तो सभी है शेर दिलावर, आनो मोहम्मद कासिम अकबर. इब्ने मज़ाहिर वहबे कल्बी, जान भी हुर भी सारे दिलावर. इब्ने मज़ाहिर वहबे कल्बी, जान भी हुर भी सारे दिलावर. अपनी जगह ये सब है बहुतर, फौज में तेरी ऐश सफदर. ऐसा अलम है कहाँ, ऐसा जवा है कहाँ, ऐसा अलम है कहाँ, ऐसा जवा है कहाँ. या हुसैन या